Good afternoon, and welcome to the Elizabeth Munves Sherman Lecture in Gender and Sexuality Studies. Okay. Each year, the Pembroke Center invites a distinguished Brown faculty member whose teaching and research speak to the mission of the center and to the work of our undergraduate and graduate programs in Gender and Sexuality Studies. This annual lecture was named for Elizabeth Munves Sherman, class of '77 and Brown parent, for her extraordinary leadership in raising funds to endow the Pembroke Center's seed grant programs. We extend our warmest thanks to Elizabeth Sherman. It is my great pleasure to welcome today Jinying Li, Assistant Professor in Modern Culture and Media. Dr. Li's focus is on the scholarly analysis of digital media and on global media circulations and cultures, with a particular emphasis on Asian media studies. Her work has involved the study of global anime, Asian screen studies, new media formations, media and the environment, and networked culture. Professor Li's first book, Anime's Knowledge Cultures, Geek Otaku Jai, explores the rise of transnational knowledge of a transnational knowledge class for whom anime is not just a particular animation form or object for subcultural connection, but, as one reviewer put it, a deterritorialized media environment that translates the operating logics of information capitalism into habitual cultural practice. The book is about both the productivity of and the fascination with constructions of knowledge in the media cultures of our era, the era of transnational information capitalism. Dr. Li's second monograph, Walled Media, Mediating Walls, examines the formation of the wall as simultaneously a material object, a structural metaphor, and a discursive principle in the recent history of digital media. As media access increasingly promises to eliminate boundaries, the notion of walls has nonetheless been used to organize various types of structural components in computerized media systems, thereby shattering the myth of borderless global access and foregrounding the regulatory power of network technologies. Her essay, A Genealogy of the Wall Screen, published in the journal Differences, traces the material and discursive formation of China's Great Firewall, a geo-blocking system for network censorship. The geo-blocking system for network censorship. She connects that to the cultural history of ping. Ping, a kind of screen used both for visual display and spatial management. Professor Li's talk today is titled Enclosure and Social Formation, Toward a Media Archeology of the Walled City. Please join me in welcoming Jinying Li to the Pembroke Center.
Thank you so much for such a warm introduction. And I also want to thank the Pembroke Center, Leila, Denise, Wendy, and everyone at the center for inviting me to give this talk. It is a great honor and pleasure to share my work with you all. And also thank you everyone for coming. It's a really lovely weather, considering the last time was supposed to be a blizzard, and we are really lucky today. A little bit too warm, but it's good. And what I will present today is part of my book project, as Denise said, is What Media Mediating Walls, which study the wall as both a media object and a metaphorical concept. So I want to propose a theoretical framework to explore the meaning and the politics of war as media by examining two types of wars in Chinese history: the wall city that I will talk about today, and the wall screen that we just talked about, published in Differences. So before talk about the wall city, let's begin with the wall. Why the wall matters. In today's geopolitical and cultural situation, it seems both ironic and utterly urgent to talk about walls. With the widespread sentiment of ethno-nationalism, tribalism, isolationism, and racism, as well as the worldwide rise of authoritarian tendency, with the escalating wars, the wars in Iran, the trade wars, and the so-called new Cold Wars. Not to mention the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic with quarantine and lockdown. It is evidently clear that world condition has become, if it has not always been, a global norm. So more than 2 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we find ourselves surrounded by layers of worlds, physical and virtual, real and fictional. Most importantly, wars have become a prevalent technological device and metaphorical concept on digital media that are supposed to eliminate all boundaries. From computer firewalls to virtual reality, from Facebook wall to China's Great Firewall, digital space is largely walled. The existence of these walls shattered the myths of what Manuel Castells had famously called so-called space of flow, and highlight the significant function of the wall as a key apparatus in managing, controlling, and mediating information, knowledge, and experience. It problematized the Enlightenment ideal of transparency, depth, openness, and universal knowledge, and underlined world mediation as a fundamental condition of modern experience. So I have taught Manuel Castells' book, The Rise of Network Society, in my digital media class a lot of times, and I increasingly realized how his notion of this space of flow is outdated now and out of touch, because recent news about the American military operation of the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz in the conflicts of Iran, right? It seems like the keywords had changed from flow to blockage. Who have a thought? When I always thought, flow of the money and the oil is supposed to be the signature of American capitalism, but it seems like no longer the case. So that's why we talk about wars. So the purpose of my project is to propose a media theory of those blocking walls as simultaneously a device and a concept. By examining its material and discursive formation as both an object and a science, I want to ask, where do these walls come from? For what purposes? What are their functions? How do social meanings of this wall derive from material conditions? In other words, I study both archaeology of the walls as media devices and the genealogy of these walls as discursive concept. As a metaphorical concept, the wall is a radical challenge and departure from the popular window metaphor that has a deep-rooted history from Alberti to Microsoft. If the window mediated by organizing our vision in relation to the physical space, the wall rather mediates our experience by organizing and mediating the space itself, giving it orientation and meaning. While the window promises a transparent vision with infinite depth, the wall manages spatial environment with borders, and the surfaces. The wall does represent alternative genealogy from the window in competing conception of the media system, shifting from optical apparatus to spatial devices, from open grid of projection to the containing surface of spatial and environmental arrangement. Changing the metaphor from the window to wall, I want to suggest a theoretical reconsideration of modern media, shifting from system of visual representation to operation of spatial and environmental management. This conceptual shift from window to the wall is also a move away from a perspective-centric conceptualization to modernity and toward a surface-oriented configuration of environmental management, mobility control, and social political demarcation. Examining the wall as a crucial object and concept, my purpose is not simply to rewrite a media history. Instead, a more imminent task is to call attention to racialize the discourse of world enclosure, which is widely perceived as the antithesis against the Western norm of liberal democracy as implement of openness and freedom. A conception of war as the abnormality that is frequently projected upon the non-Western others, such as China in particular and Asia in general. Hence, the popular perception of Asia, especially China, as the world other, against which the West celebrate open self, the open market, trade, information network, and so forth. So the Western as a normality of the openness, and Asia as the abnormality of the world others. So to interrogate this racialized discourse, I start with a very simple question. If war is such a fundamental condition for modern media and society, why is it never perceived as such? The Enlightenment idea of open knowledge and transparency, as well as the capitalist idea of open trade and market, paved the ideological foundation of Western modernity, which needs us to think of the windows and forget about the walls. Therefore, to sustain this Western myth of modern openness, the existence of war must be disavowed, oppressed, and abjected to the non-Western others. Thus, the racialized imagination of China as a world nation and Asia as enclosed culture identity. And to question this discourse of world Asian others, we must unearth the war from its racialized abjection and concealment, rediscovering and rethinking the war as a foundational object and concept in mediating all human lives and society. And to do so, I first examined what's the meaning of the war as both object and concept, and start with two very basic structural conditions of war as a media device, that is, as enclosing barrier and a displaying surface. Start with a barrier. As a barrier, the wall is a controlling apparatus, not simply device, but also regulate passages and produce leverage. It concentrates power to those who manage the wall. By concentrating the power, wall as a barrier tends to be a polarizing structure that polarizes social space, inside and outside, center and edge, rich and poor, men and women, us versus them. The wall thus belongs to what Bernard Seeger described as the so-called cultural techniques of dwelling that operate through making distinctions. However, unlike other distinction-making structures such as a door or a window that you can close or open, the wall as a barrier is more absolute. The wall is to be obeyed. The symbolic meaning of the wall as a barrier, therefore, tends to be political. As a political symbol, the wall is often staged as a spectacle, which is tied to the wall's other condition as a displaying surface. At the surface, the wall is a message board to be inscribed with words and pictures. Writing on the wall is one of the most ancient modes of communication and documentation. The surface condition makes a wall a displaying screen. As a screening surface, the wall also is an asymmetrical device that distinguishes between the front and back, what is on the screen and what is behind, what is reviewed and what is concealed. The wall's surface condition of display, therefore, is inherently tied to its barrier condition of division and enclosure. So barrier and the surface are the two foundational organization of the wall, the organizational condition of the wall that always operates simultaneously. And my argument is it's also the two foundational conditions of all media broadly. Basically, all media can be characterized as either a screen for communication or a barrier to enclose a space and community. So as a barrier, a wall can be rigid and containing, and as a surface can be light and transformative. Both the barrier and the surface, a wall is an asymmetrical and contradictory structure full of tension. So my task is to trace these two fundamental conditions of wall as well as the two conditions of media, which is simultaneously a barrier that encloses a territory community, as well as a surface that displays message and power. So I trace these two foundational conditions to the two archetypal walls in Chinese history, the Chong wall city and the Ping, the wall screen. Each serve as a powerful primal scene for conceptualization of war as media. So I borrowed the notion of the primal scene from Francesco Casati, who has an article called The Primal Screen. So the notion of primal scene is not referring to an origin or a prototype, but is rather what we retrospectively perceive as explanation for the emergence of a dispositive, an operational assemblage that define a media system as well as a social cultural convention. So what fascinates me about this primal war, I guess, is this potential overlap between a media archaeology and the psychoanalysis, because both suggesting the deeper hidden layers of meaning of the primal and artifact that to be dug out. Like psychoanalysis, something in your past to be dug out, similar as archaeology. So my focus today is the Cheng, the wall city. So in Chinese language, the word wall can be written as either qiang or cheng. Qiang referred to a domestic wall, emphasizing its architectural function and technology of wall building. Cheng, on the other hand, highlights the social function of wall in making a community. referring to a city wall or a city itself. The term Cheng emphasizes the material, conceptual, and historical overlap between a city and a wall, as a city is often developed by building a wall to carve its boundary, to defend its territory, and to enclose a space for people's inhabitation. The word Cheng is therefore defined by the social function of the wall to generate a community through spatial enclosure. So my focus on this relationship between the spatial enclosure and the social formation, that is, how the wall create a community by enclosing the space, by studying the archeology of Cheng, the wall city, as media system. By archeology, however, I'm not really referring to the technological past buried in media history, as the term is often metaphorically used in the so-called media archeology as a field. Instead, I turn to the textual and formal realm, examining the history of Cheng in etymology, narrative, and graphic design. I use the signification form of Cheng as iconic and a symbolic representation of material and media history of the world city. So what I do is taking the changing meaning of the word Cheng as the basis for archaeology of the medium, the world city. So I begin by studying the etymological transformation. Oh, but basically, it's here actually, I'm sorry, this is where. I started by studying the etymology transformation of the Chinese character Cheng in its pictorial ideographic form as the archaeological trace of the walled city, followed by tracing the changing narrative of the a story of Meng Jiangnu, iconic text about walls, and then examine how the meaning of Cheng changed with a colonization of the design model of ideal walled city. So examining this representational form of Cheng, a word, a story, and a model, and map a media archaeology of the walled city through its history of meanings. This archaeology provides an illuminating paradigm to probe the Cheng's digital rendition in today's digital media platforms, interrogating why a media system intended for guiding us for a community turns out to be one that discriminates and divides. So let's start with the word. So my idea is, which probably wrong, because the Chinese characters are pictographic, I argue they function like archaeological sites, allowing us to trace the material history of media object by looking at their signification form in text as pictures. The iconographic form of Chinese script, therefore, can be used as pictorial symbolic representation of a media history, whereby the changing shapes and the meaning of a character give us a clue about the changing material and the function of a media system, allowing us to take the etymology of the concept as a basis for archaeology of the medium. For example, the first one, the Chinese character Qiang, as I mentioned, is a generic term for wall. Its logographic form represent not only the function of wall as architectural elements, but also the history of technology in wall building. The character's left, I cannot put it, but how I show it? The left part, okay, just look at the upper top, the left part, is the pictographic depiction of old techniques of wall building with rammed earth and woodwork. So it looks like earth and the wood structure, right, is how it was built. And the right part is the ideographic signification of the wall's original function for protecting crops with enclosed structure or barn. So if you look at the right side, the upper part is crops, looks like crops, right? The lower parts is a circular structure of a barn. So this is a picture, it's literally a graphic of how the wall is mean. So, and the character therefore function as an archaeological site, whereby the deep time of the wall as a material device is flattened in the changing graphic form of its pictorial symbolic representation as the character of Xiang. That's why my idea is you look at the picture, it's archaeology. I might be wrong though. So in a similar fashion, the character Cheng in its configuration and transformation represent the material conceptual formation of the walled city. The character left side, if you look at this bottom part on the left, it's on the left side. What it looks like. The left side is a pictographic representation of two wall towers facing each other. Can you see that in the left side? Face each other, okay. So it's signifying the entry point of a walled city, right? And the right side, Cheng, if you look at the bottom part of Cheng, the right side, is a phonic and ideographic signification, meaning to complete, to enable, and to accommodate. And the combination described the function of the Cheng as enclosing settlement to complete and enable the walled city, to enable the city by containing and accommodating its people. As it is defined by the Chinese ancient dictionary, Cheng means to hold and accommodate people. 诚意诚民也. Here is the dictionary. Means the city is to hold and accommodate people. So the etymological history of the word Cheng demonstrates that the meaning of the walled city is not simply about a territory boundary, but about social formation. It identifies Cheng with the people of the city. It's a sign for both a place and its community. This archaeological overlap between the social formation of a city and the spatial enclosure by the wall can be seen in the urban geography of many Chinese cities, such as city of Beijing, where I spent many years. It's structured famously by this enclosed layer of circular walls. This circular design for Beijing, enclosed by layers of walls, was developed in the Ming Dynasty, as you saw here, last till today. One layer of the walls simply replaced by circular of the rows. So they literally call the first ring, second ring, and third ring. So Beijing is a circle of rings, if you know the city, okay? Which developed from the wall, you know. So this archaeological overlap between the social formation of it's a Beijing, okay. And the more extreme version of this Cheng is Kowloon Walled City in Hong Kong, Jiulongzhaicheng, an urban enclave inhabited by the lower class Chinese community in the colonial territory. It is ultimate walled city, the overlap between enclosure of the wall and the inhabitation of the city. And it also is anti-colonial struggle to close your community against the colonizers. In the Chinese history, the most famous Cheng is no other than Changcheng, the Great Wall, which literally means the long wall city. Although often imagined as a grandiose spectacle that marks extensive northern border of China Empire, Changcheng, in fact, is a less continuous border wall despite its name than an assembly of fragmented defense fortresses connecting a series of border towns and cities. The construction of the Great Wall is a decisive moment in the history of Cheng. Its formation as both a military border and the symbol of China Empire marks the pivotal transformation of Cheng as a device and concept, whose meaning changed from a social political expression of a local community to a political symbol of imperial sovereignty. This transformation in the meaning of Cheng is manifested by the changing narrative about a legendary woman figure, Meng Jiangli, or Lady Meng Jiang, who is famously reputed to have brought down the Great Wall with her crying tear of sorrow. So this legendary or mythical story goes like this. Meng Jiang's husband, Qi Liang, was sent to the border as a forced labor to build the Great Wall. So Meng Jiang followed her husband to the construction site, only to learn of his tragic death. Mourning for the death of her husband, Meng Jiang wept so sadly that her tear allegedly caused the collapse of the wall. Lady Meng Jiang was therefore celebrated as a cultural symbol of folk resistance against imperial tyranny. Despite being one of the most iconic figures in the cultural history of the Great Wall, the story of Meng Jiang, in fact, was not formulated as what is commonly known today until Tang Dynasty, which is more than 1,000 years after the wall was originally built. But there were earlier historical traces of this legendary woman, whose story, however, did not emerge in the Qin Dynasty when the wall was built by China's first emperor as a symbol of imperial power. Instead, the earlier trace of the story emerged much earlier in the pre-Qin period in the 5th century BC, before China was unified as empire and before the wall was even built. In other words, the origin of the story predated the construction of the Great Wall. In this early version of the story, there's also a woman who mourns the death of her husband at a wall. But instead of Changcheng, the Great Wall, the story actually takes place at Cheng, the city wall, or the wall city. In the narrative, a woman identified as wife of Qi Liang asked for a ritual ceremony to mourn for the death of her husband, a soldier who died in the war for fighting for the city-state. She performed the ritual of public mourning by crying at the city wall. And her wailing was so moving that it caused the wall to collapse. The story is not about Great Wall, but about the wall city. And it's less about defiance against tyranny than about the social ritual of mourning performed as media events. highlighted by the theoretical aspect and public dimension. So if we think about this story as a media event, it consists of three elements. First, an audience, right? The passengers at the city wall who were moved by the ladies crying. And the second, the action, the performance, ku, the weeping, which was less an individual expression of internal emotion than a public performance of ritual mourning, a socially organized activity of communication with a communal audience. The third, the medium, and most importantly, Cheng, the walled city, where the ritual performance took place to reach its audience. So Cheng fulfilled its social media function through three capacities. First, as a public site, it is a media platform for social gathering, right? It's a stage. Secondly, as an open stage, it's a displaying screen to deliver a performance, like a screen in the theater or cinema. Third, as a symbolic representation of the city itself, Cheng is a sign for social cohesion because it is defined as a settlement to accommodate people, right? Cheng, to accommodate people. As a representation of the city's social community more than as a physical boundary, Cheng is often described as a living subject rather than a non-living thing. It is not simply a location, but is the addressee to whom the lady wept to. So if you read the story, it's also about she is crying to the wall rather than crying to people, like 向城而哭. So, and the crying to the wall is the crying to the community, because the wall represents the community, right? The lady's performance of weeping is mediated by the wall as a social demand, a cry for communal sympathy and solidarity, asking the fellow residents in the community to share her sorrow of loss. Combining these three elements, the popular story of a lady weeping at a wall suggests a significant function of the Cheng as a social medium. The wall mediates a socially organized performance of ritual mourning by functioning not only as a material device for public gathering, but also a symbolic representation of a community. Because the wall signified the social integrity of a city by serving not simply as the boundary of its territory, but as accommodation of its populace. The symbolic collapse of the wall, therefore, can be read as a moral fable regarding the ethics of communal solidarity and unity. If we cannot share the sorrow for the loss of one member, the community of Cheng may well collapse like the wall. So it's a moral fable of communal unity. So this early narrative about Lady Mengjiang defined the meaning of Cheng by underlining its social media function. It is a material platform for public performance ritual as well as a symbolic site to display communal support and protection, and mediate and signify the social formation of the city as a community. Only after the building of the Great Wall at the dawn of China's first empire did the meaning of Cheng dramatically transform from a social cohesion to the local community to the political power of imperial sovereignty. So build the Great Wall is really important to changing the meaning. And the story of the Lady Mengjiang also changed dramatically from a moral fable about communal solidarity to a popular myth about folk resistance against imperial tyranny. So the woman's story is because of changing the meaning of the wall. This changing narrative of Lady Mengjiang with a conceptual transformation of Cheng from community to sovereignty echoes contemporary Greek tragedy of Antigone, which is written in the almost exactly same historical moment of the 5th century BC. The two really written at the same time. Antigone is one of the 4 children of Oedipus. Her brother dies, the very famous story, right? Her brother dies in the war fighting against the ruler of the city in the failed attempt to take control of the power. And Antigone wants to bring her brother's body inside the city wall for a proper burial, but her uncle, who is also the ruler of the city, forbid her from doing so because her brother dies as enemy of the city-states and should be punished by the denial of the communal mourning. So this is a very famous text, right? For a lot of Western thinkers, from Aristotle to Hegel, the story of Antigone is a significant text, often read as allegory for the relationship between kingship and the state in the Greek concept of a polis, a political entity that is founded on the social relation of communal kingship but replaces with state laws. But what is often overlooked in the story of Antigone is the significance of the wall as a symbolic site for the foundation of a polis as city-states. Because it is the wall that defines not only the city's physical territory, but also its social and political integrity. Who is inside or outside the wall defines who is our enemy or members. Therefore, Antigone is forbidden from taking her brother's body inside the wall because the brother already outside, no longer the member of community, you cannot bring her in. And also failing to obey the order will be punished by being killed at the wall. So wall is a very important dramatic site for the story. The wall is a site for both political recognition and public punishment. Here the site, the wall, and the people of the city merge into one in the formation of polis. As the steward Alden argues, the story of Antigone is about the relation between a walled territory and the community living in it. He said, quote, "The polis must be understood as a dual sense, as a site where the action takes place and as a people who live there. Both the territory of the site and the integrity of the populace are to be protected and defined by the wall." Echoing the Chinese notion of Cheng, the great concept of polis is also built upon the overlap between the wall and the city, between spatial enclosure and the social formation. So both the Chinese legend of Lady Mengjiang and the Greek tragedy of Antigone underline the significance of the wall in the formation of a community in spatial and the social political means. But more importantly, they also highlight the gender of woman as a performer, negotiator vis-a-vis the wall city. Like Mengjiang's weeping at the wall, Antigone's action also rely on the wall as a crucial media device because the whole drama is about whether she can bring her brother inside the wall, right? It's a very important media device for her. So and as both women, their fate are intricately tied to the wall because both Mengjiang and Antigone perform their gender roles as a significant mediator in the historical formation and transformation of Cheng and polis. For Antigone, her gender role as a woman challenged the limits of the polis as simultaneously bounded the place, a social community, and the political state. The tension among which is to be confronted by Antigone, whose action, claim, and her existence as a product of incest, right? I mean, she's a daughter of the insexual relationship. And her very existence transgressed the walled boundary between family and the state, kingship and law, life and death. As Judith Butler argued, the power of Antigone's story is its demonstration of the social deformation of both idealized kingship and the political sovereignty that emerge as a consequence of her act, in which she transgresses both gender and the kingship norms. Butler therefore interpreted Antigone as a very important figure of political defiance against the limits of both the normative kingship and the state order. She said, quote, "As a figure for politics, she points somewhere else, not to politics as a question of representation, but to that political possibility that emerge when the limits to representation and representability are exposed." Butler's reading of Antigone reminds us how such social political limits of representation, are materialized and represented through the wall. What Antigone challenged not simply the kingship of the state, but is the limits of the polis as a walled territory and the social body. For her action insists on the barrier of her brother within the bounds of the polis, within the wall. So Antigone's feminine defiance is performed both against within the polis wall as a crucial backdrop and the media device, because it is a material and symbolic placement of the wall that marks the limits of intelligibility within the bounds of a social body. Antigone's transgression of the gender and kingship norm, therefore, not only underlines the wall, but also recalibrates her marginalized relationship with the wall. For the wall defines what is intelligible, livable, that is, what to be included in the social formation, the delineation of the polis as both a place and a community. So really, if there's a limit that Antigone fight against, that's this walled boundary. Compared with Antigone, Lady Mengjiang was not really, at least in her early story, not so much a figure of political defiance. However, the later popularized version of her legend, in which her tears supposed to brought down the whole Great Wall, is often read as popular fable of feminine resistance against imperial authority. So the question of whether to align Mengjiang with the kingship tradition or political subversion points to the significant but problematic position of women vis-a-vis the historical transition of the wall city as a social formation with boundaries. the transformation of the narrative, of her earlier mourning to her resistance figure, the transformation of this changing narrative rooted in the changing notion of the walled city, from a social body based on communal kinship to a political entity governed by state law, a transition this female figure both embodied and marginalized from. So the idea is those women are marginalized because they're often imagined as a pre-political figure associated with kinship. So therefore, they are excluded from the walled city because the walled city changed its meaning from a community to a political entity. So when it's a community, they're part of it. But when the walled city become a political state, they're being excluded. So what those women are against are not really the wall itself, but rather the changing meaning of the wall from community to sovereignty. So in the legend of Lady Mengjiang, the changing narrative from the early story about performing social rituals for communal support to the later popular fable about staging political resistance against imperial tyranny indicate a historical change of Cheng's meaning from a sign of community to that of sovereignty, corresponding to the changing narrative location from Cheng, the walled city, to Changcheng, the Great Wall. Therefore, the imaginary of Mengjiang as such an allegory figure of subaltern protest is so powerful precisely because the Great Wall has become such a potent symbol of imperial brutality. The meaning of Cheng changes the semantic center from the communal to the political, which positions the woman as a pre-political being excluded to the external, to everything that the wall symbolizes. In other words, the woman is not really external to the wall, but they are positioned to the outside, to the external, because the symbolic meaning of the wall changed. Right? The wall changed from family to the state, from communal to the political. Therefore, women are excluded. So in a similar fashion, Antigone's much debated status in relation to kingship or state is due to the ambiguity of the polis that is tied to both the familial and the political. The problematic of the women and their struggle marks the changing limits of the walled city and its shifting meaning from the spatial to the social to political. Therefore, so my reading is those women's struggle are not really against the wall, as I said, but really they're mapping the transformation of the meaning of the walled city from the communal to the political. So the tension between social formation and political order and the changing meaning of the Cheng are also demonstrated by the way in which the walled city is envisioned, designed, and represented in the Chinese visual culture, as you see in this map, at a perfectly rectangular square. Do you see the small square? Surrounding the administrative seats. Now, every city in Chinese map is a square, perfect square, to indicate Cheng's function as a political sign to represent imperial ruling. This graphic form has been idealized and perpetualized for almost 2,000 years. As early as the Han Dynasty, which is 200 BC, a profound imperial ideology of Cheng has been canonized by a rigorously measured form of urban planning. Recorded as a model for Wang Cheng, the ruler's walled city, this conception has prescribed the design philosophy of how an ideal walled city should be, marked by the uniformity of rectangular shape, straight lines, square corners, cardinal coordinations, and orderly grids, all of which culminates to the spatial signification of idealized polity. So even when the urban geography of the actual city did not comply to this prescribed model, such as Suzhou, anybody know Suzhou? Suzhou is a very irregular city. The city called the Chinese Venus, which means it's structured by river. But if you look at this one, it doesn't look like a city structured by river, but the city very squarely mathematically defined by walls, right? So even when the city does not comply to this mathematical model, they're still being represented in such a geometrically measured manner to reproduce a standardized image of an ideal walled city as embodiment of political order and stability. So when I look at the map, I'm really surprised. It doesn't look like Suzhou, I know. Suzhou is really a very irregular city, because it's controlled by river rather than walls. So this idealized walled city was given the full expression in the capital city of Chang'an in Tang Dynasty, as urban design was famous for being divided into 108 walled walls, like called the Lifang walls, with geometrical precision, with asymmetrical grid. This strictly ordered walled city with geometrical precision was intended as a very effective political machine for regulating passage and organization, optimizing the social political division hierarchy into the spatial and visual knowledge of the city. This meticulously designed walled city with geometrically measured form transformed the meaning of Cheng from a social medium for communal support organization to a political technology that translates state order to spatial orders. Designed with such a uniform spatial pattern, Cheng is no longer envisioned to be the combination of community, but is rather extension of imperial state. So if the social formation of community is always tied to the spatial enclosure with walls, then the changing form and meaning of Cheng reminds us how a walled settlement to accommodate people can develop to a ruling device of political governance. This transformation, however, did not come from the walled city itself, but rather hinged upon the geometrically enabled form of spatial organization. It was developed of this kind of mathematically measured model of ideal walled city that transformed the Cheng from a social assembly for Lady Mengjiang to cry for help to the political capital of Tang Dynasty as a political machine. And this is probably the most important lesson we learn from archaeology of walled city. So this transformation of Cheng from a social medium to political machine echoes a popular perception of today's digital platform that are believed to have devolved from a utopian public sphere for social organization to a dystopian echo chamber with divisiveness, polarization, and inequality. According to Wendy Cheng, though, this decisive turn to division and enclosure is not the unfortunate failure of digital platform, but rather the intended feature embedded in their design philosophy that follows mid-century idea of homophily that believes similarity breeds connection, which are meant to divide and dissolve the masses into policed and gated neighborhoods. So you see this gated neighborhood from East-Central America for racial segregation, and it's kind of very similar to the Tang Chang'an, right, with the divided social wars. So there's two of similar kind of logic with the division, ward division, and enclosure for social segregation, division, and hierarchy. So reading Wendy Cheng's examination of homophily against the Chinese history of Cheng, one cannot help but wonder if the model of homophily may find its ancient trace in the ideological conception of an ideal walled city in imperial China, a mathematically enabled vision of spatial visual order with the word enclosure and division as a ruling technique of imperial state. The political violence in both the concept of homophily and the model walled city is their assertion of a prescriptive authority. Instead of taking social spatial division as a condition to interrogate, they prescribe it as a model for what a city, a neighborhood, or a digital platform should be. Like the uniform image of an ideal walled city to dictate the design and representation of those Chinese cities whose geography don't even comply to the basic rectangular shape. As mentioned, Suzhou, which is an irregular city, but presented with such walled regularity. So as Cheng said, rather than framing homophily as a historical contingent, they portray it as natural and timeless. The danger, therefore, lies in the erasure of history. So one way to counter such danger is to rediscover the historical contingencies that are obscured and naturalized by the presumed timelessness. As archaeology of Cheng demonstrates, the meaning and the function of the walled city are indeed historically contingent. Before it became a technique for engineering social political division, the walled city had been and continued being a powerful medium for communal organization and communal support, right, for the Lady Mengjiang. And its social media function did not necessarily presume segregation or inequality. Although spatial enclosure is an inherent condition for social formation, how people interact, inhabit, and live with such a condition is historically contingent. And that contingency, the contingency which is a contradiction between a canonized design of ideal walled city as a timeless standard versus the actual lived space of a city as a historical variability, is how a performative claim of Mengjiang and Antigone reached the community and irritability. how this performative dimension can be explored in and raise the walled city as a medium of social formation against its inherent order of spatial enclosure is a key lesson I think we should learn from the Chinese history of Cheng to think today's digital platform. So that's the end of my story. Thank you. This is the people who has been helping me with revision comments and everything, including the nice editors' differences in here. Thank you. So, any questions, comments?
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I have a question about how you might think about the subcategory of the paywall. And there are a lot of situations, different kinds of paywalls we might consider, but for instance, just an obvious one that comes to mind is the rituals of protest that arise in a space like a subreddit when people post paywalled media content and everybody rallies around to say, here's how you get around this, you shouldn't post this content, here's what is actually there behind the wall. So these situations where there's a fee to get through a wall of some kind, and the wall might thereby be rendered, who can say, maybe you can say transparent, permeable, temporarily dematerialized, maybe it matters which one it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think one of the key arguments is people often believe capitalism working through flow and circulation, but the paywall indicating actually capitalism operate through enclosed controlled property, right? And the paywall very important indication of how capitalism working through walled blockage and closure rather than open circulation. And the kind of narrative you saw on Reddit is interesting because it indeed working through the sort of almost a popular myth as if digital media, even though it's a wall, we can also using digital media technology to sort of negate a wall or transpass the wall. But my argument is that this kind of a narrative may not be helpful because it gives you a wishful thinking that by believing in the transparency, the wall will disappear by itself. But I think that's kind of the argument that the book tried to put against, because I think the argument is the problem of modernity is not that it's too open or got a wall, but because, or the problem is not that modernity was never open, which is my argument, but rather modernity never open, but pretend it's open. Open is the biggest fiction of modernity. And the problem is by pretending to the open, it has to be oppressed the wall. And the danger is precisely when we believe the wall can disappear by a certain maneuver. And that's the biggest problem of this modern myth of openness. And I think I use a sort of fable in my conclusion chapter is there's a Chinese fable called, there's a Taoist trick is that you can go through wall if you don't believe existence. But actually, my whole argument is this kind of magic is not going to work. It's a wishful thinking. Huh? Yeah. By believing it's wall, you're actually strengthening it. Because the wall, my argument, wall working as so-called a negative media. It works better when you forget it. So our lesson is the moment you believe its disappearance is the moment the wall come back and hit you right on your face. And that's why I think the kind of narrative you can get rid of the paywall or expose it is kind of this similar to this magical thinking. And that's the problem because when you think you can get rid of the wall by digitally connecting everyone, that's the moment the wall come back and hit your heart, like what we see today. Social media become more and more authoritarian, and the Western society become more and more authoritarian, right? And that's because we thought globalization, digital media, get rid of the wall. And that's the moment wall come back and hit us right in our face.
Thank you so much.
Lila? Yeah, I think Lila may be leaving. So.
Thank you so much for the dazzling talk. I was very intrigued by how your analysis of state sovereignty replaces, in a way, the figure of the nation with the figure of the city. Yes. And I'd love to draw you out more on that, because there is a whole assemblage of ideas, in the nation, the boundary, territory, population, exclusion, and here we have a totally different lexicon. City enclosure, territory disappears, exclusion disappears. So it's another conception of power, and I just want to draw you out on how you.
It's a great question. I think the reason I focus on this wall city because, of course, it's the term indicating it. But it's also, in a way, just like the Greek term polis or the Chinese term wall. It's both a unit, but also a model, right? It's a model to thinking about bigger empire or the state. Of course, it's not the same, but it's a model. It's a model to. What is model? Model is to say there's certain equilibrium when you change the scale, right? So I see it as a model. But what is model actually about? The model is not about it's either a community or just segregation. The model tells us there is a moment of transformation, right? There is a moment that the world closure could be something else, though it become this sort of state. And I think similar to nation, nationalism has a moment. It could be about struggle and cohesion. Yet, when they combine with nation state, it becomes something, or at least in certain occasion becomes something else, right? So by looking at the world city as a model, we may look at something in the bigger, like a nationalism, national movement, or nation state in a broader category. So that's why I see it somewhat as looking at this transformation moment. It's not either or. It's not like it's a communal for the woman or it's state for Antigone to struggle. But the very fact there's two stories happening at the same time with this such dramatic transformation telling us this is a moment of contingency. It could be go different ways, right? And I want to see it as a model because it tells us there could be another possibility, right? The world closure, yes, violence is, but it could be something else. And at the moment, there are historical moments, there are something else, right? And I want to see it like a nation used to be something else, used to be this cohesion, decolonial movement, though it become something also later something different. So I'm thinking about it as a way to thinking about many different entity in different scale, a nation, of course, platform. Also, the kind of today's we are thinking of community, what a community means, and how the closure is both a limitation, exclusion. But if we can, I think if we can map out where does exclusion happen, we might be able to find how to do it differently. For example, my chart history is about how did this happening when the Cheng become this matter geometrically, standardized. And that's actually, if you think about nation, there's a moment nationalism also becomes certain kind of standardization. Who belong to this nation? What is a model citizen for the nation? And similar to the Cheng become this geographically mapped, no matter what kind of city, even a irregular city become a standard square. Just like a nation sometimes, different race, different ethnicity, different gender, all become this model citizen of the nation, including something else, like excluding the internal diversity or heterogeneity within the nation. So I think from this small model of a city, we might be able to look at this also the moment of different possibility of a nation as well. Yeah. Alan?
Thank you. So this came to mind when you were speaking about the paywall. Mm-hmm. Would you maybe speculate on whether there's a different political economy of the wall being worked out in China and in Euro-America?
I used to think there are, but right now, seriously, with the current situation, my mother was like, "Oh, American was like Cultural Revolution, come back to China." I used to believe there are differences. Now I think this is, I don't want to say false equivalency, but they're still making me very, very worried right now, increasingly difference. So if you're technologically, I'm talking about technique, computational, Great Firewall and Firewall and Paywall has no difference at all. Technologically, they're exactly the same, computational-wise. Okay, there's just functional difference. Technology is the same, but that's why it's easy to slippery from a paywall to a Great Firewall to the sovereignty to the censorship, because it's the same technology. In other words, there's nothing stop Google or American government to make a great firewall to censor everybody information. Technology, they can do it any minutes.
Yeah.
If Trump wants to do it, they could technologically. So technological, no difference. Of course, it's about political situation. But political situation right now is increasingly more and more slippery. That's why I hope this book could be like a warning sign that this kind of technology can happening everywhere. I'm not saying that the China's war is similar as American war or the Great Firewall the same as the paywall, but technologically they are the same, which means under certain political circumstances, the paywall could become a Great Firewall. The community could become this very rigorously defined imprisonment of regulation, the political machine. So, and we already see that, right? And so that's why this is supposed to be, I want it to be something like a warning sign, particularly right now because you know the AI with this data race, there are a lot of extraction for data and the race for ownership of data, enclosure of the data, and also right now in Europe, there's a huge push for digital sovereignty. And ironically, if you read their paper about digital sovereignty, they are looking at China as a model, how to claim their digital sovereignty.
I just wondered, in part because of the deep history that you've done, given that the history is different, not that we would necessarily end up in a place in any way better at, at all, but just that the rhetorics in a way would have to be different.
Yes, that's true. That's true. I think of course there is very different between the kind of this imperial feudal structure that we built into this versus the capitalist model. Right. So I try to see the balance between this kind of historical differences. We try to see some kind of connection. I think one problem with archaeology method, I think a lot of people would agree, is that archaeology sometimes, by aiming for those deeper connection despite the disjunction, sometimes overlooking historical differences. I mean, all archaeology had this kind of problem if you look at closely. So it's the way it's about balance, right? So I think I am trying to be cautious sometimes in making a claim, so that's why the last part I make it very fast, because I don't want to make overclaim that Overfeely is whatever. But I want to see the analogy because it may be something we can gain from there. Yes, of course, the Chinese history is different from mid-century. This mid-century America has specifically racial segregation, and the Chinese feudal had its own reason for segregating. But the very fact that both had similar model of how segregating people, I think could be useful to thinking about a deeper history or a deeper mechanism how things happen. Of course, the American homophilia has a specific American history, like a mid-century racism, racial segregation, and capitalist enclosure that film into digital platform, versus China has this deeper history of imperial and feudal regulation of men and women, and rich and poor and different classes, how they regulate that. But yeah, I try to see the connections because I think this lesson we learn from this Chinese model may be able to have some different ideas, because a lot of people already been talking about, American history, and there was so much we can learn from that. What if a new angle might have something different? Yeah, we already know racism coming from, colonial or whatever, and at a certain point, I think we need to thinking about things that are not just limiting to the similar kind of power structure and the brutality is not just happening in American racial history. It has a broader and deeper history.
Thank you.
And the war is such a method for thinking because it's such a universal and the most ancient, right? Unlike other internet, it had to stop from somewhere like 1960s, or it cannot go even earlier. But war is ever since human civilization. So that's why it could map deeper.
So just one quick comment before my question, which was just a quick thing in what you were saying in response to Leela about how the wall could have been different. It could be different. I think it's interesting to reflect on the phrase, the writings on the wall, which people often use to mean, oh, like you can see a change needs to happen. Like a change is obvious, it needs to happen. So, but that wasn't my question. And my question sort of maybe a little bit continues sort of what Ellen was asking, or maybe is asking you to make a connection to current political events, exactly as you're saying you're a little hesitant to do. So I'm sorry if it's sort of not a fair question, but I was really taken with the story that you told about the lady who, you know, the kind of feminized tears is what brings a wall down, or maybe more accurately, as you were showing, what reveals the kind of shift from thinking about wall as a support for a community to wall as an instrument of power. So I'm thinking about, you know, in terms of today's politics, right? Like even something like the situation with, you know, Trump wanting to insist on his wall and getting people out and over the wall, and even like ICE agents being kind of mobile symbols of the wall, right, going in. And then you get people kind of posting on their Facebook walls these images of, again, feminized tears of people crying over people being deported. And it's almost like they're attempting to say, these are our community members, like bring it back to thinking about community instead of sovereignty, and saying, these are our community members. Like, look at these people crying as their children are being ripped away, like these images of like kids being taken, right, and thrown behind prison walls. So saying like, these are our community members, and we need to think about them as our communities and not just people who should be over the wall. So if there's some way, again, where now there's like the images of women's tears or feminized tears being you know, again, posted on these like digital walls in an attempt to kind of recreate a community over sovereignty. And if you see any hope in that, or if you think it just keeps that cycle going.
Yeah, you mentioned a very good question. It's actually, that's exactly what my original intention for the chapter to be. I actually, originally, this is my longest chapter in the book. I wrote a lot about women living, both struggling, but also taking advantage of the war. For example, in the geometrical measure of the city, I talk a lot about in Chinese literature, how women both actually fighting, but also using the war to protect themselves, create their own community. It was documented in a lot of literature, particularly a lot of romantic novel. So there is a possibility the war not necessarily oppressive. You can hack the war, you can fold the war, you can use the war for your own sort of, despite the war intended as a governing machine, you can actually subvert it in many different ways. I'm mentioning the erotic novel, a lot of sex happening in the war, even queer sex, also homoerotic story about women homosocial bonding within the walls. So I'll talk a lot of that. And also in the last part, I remember I mentioned a recent anime called Cologne generic romance about the Cologne walled city. So the Cologne walled city is also important because it is about anti-colonial, how the Chinese community formed this. But I eventually, I don't know, it's too long, and a lot of reviewers actually delete it, and now it seems like it's general sentiments. I should always critiquing the war, not writing too much positive about the wars. So I kind of get rid of it because it's too long. But you're right, I do want to thinking about the alternate possibilities. I think I might actually adding a little bit more because I do have a lot of material. I wrote a lot of those in my original version. I get rid of it about women sort of building their homosocial bonding within those walls and using those as a way of subversiveness from both historical literature to today's popular media like film and animation. So I do have a lot of thoughts about that. And so even though I don't really know whether we can see a pattern in how people do that. There are a lot of incidents. There are a lot of examples how people sort of feminist how would I say, feminist hacking or subversion of the wall. So I do have a lot of those examples. But the reason I eventually didn't put in because I didn't see a pattern. Maybe without a pattern is a good thing because the pattern is about standardization. So, but because of I didn't really see rather what's the common traits because they're very diverse. So I don't really know how to summarize it. So I put it somewhere in the chapter, but I think I probably need to investigate a little bit more, right? That's a good point, yeah. But there is actually the Cologne generic romance anime is about the wall already being torn down, but people using their imagination to invent this wall. And within the wall, there are a lot of queer identity, like people who cannot admit they're queer or their different identity find their freedom within the wall. I think that's kind of something what I find powerful, that people in the other white heteronormative society find their protection within this imaginary walled city by finding their queer identity, their feminist freedom, their memory, and their loss. That's a great anime, highly recommended, called a colon generic romance. So I'm an anime fan, by the way. I watch a lot of anime for my book. Yeah. Any other question? Mark, yeah.
Thank you for a great talk. I was wondering if you could talk about the embodied construction of a wall as a form of resistance, and I'm thinking about barricades or human walls. So, thinking about as resistance to state power or building community through an embodied practice of constructing a wall.
Yeah. Actually, there are recently there's a book I think came out. I forgot the author's name. She teaches, I think, in Philadelphia. She has a whole book about wall and block, particularly from the art history perspective, like a graffiti, the arts installation through wall and blockage. So it is actually a very productive area of study, particularly in urban studies, how people are using the actual walls. And because my book particularly focused on digital media, I did talk about artists. I call them folding the wall in virtual reality, using VR technology and using digital arts like digital graffiti on the Great Firewall to generating certain kind of subversive practices. So I did mentioning that. I think the whole idea is wall is not to be gotten rid of or forgotten, because that's the magical thinking I try to critique. That is, I think my argument is the best way to live in our current society of authoritarian tendency is not to take a war simply as a problem to get rid of, but taking the war as a fundamental condition to be understood. That you cannot get rid of the war. It's not a glitch to be get rid of, to be solved. It's a condition to be understood and to be negotiated. So my idea, you cannot really get rid of the war. Like the best strategy of resistance is not to get rid of the war, abolish the war, because that's not impossible. That's not impossible. That's magical thinking. But the best way to fold the war. So I use Deleuze's notion and talk about the many different kind of experience of the war. Actually, I talk about, I think, in Chinese history, even though during the Great War, there is a 1,000-year history, local farmers stealing the stone and the bricks and making their houses. So I see that as kind of very typical example of repurposing the wall as a folding. And also I mentioned a lot of, again, romantic novels, like, as women write a lot of novel about how many sex happen on the wall in Chinese literature. So that's kind of my idea, so. Seriously, if you read a lot of Chinese erotic novels, as I did, you'll find so many amazing stories about sex on the wall. And the queer sex too. So.
That's not quite a revolutionary model. It's very exciting.
Yeah.
It's a kind of, to understand, not to wish it away.
So I do propose how to, I think at the end of the last sentence in my book is, even though there was war resistance, but the ways to fold the wall is infinite, right? Eroticization, repurposing. So I think I want to give a very positive hope. Yeah. Any others? Please join us for a reception. Thank you so much.